Chapter 2: Classical Political Economy. A Theory of Society. 19th century social thought was dominated by classical political economy, a set of doctrines that served as a negative point of reference where it did not act as a positive inspiration. For this reason, classical political economy has to be the starting point for any serious study of Marxism or modern sociology. For both were born out of debates that surrounded classical political economy. The term classical political economy refers to theories developed between the 1600s and the 1800s that sought to conceptualize the structure of society on the basis of an understanding of society's economic foundation. The starting point of these theories was the abstract individual property owner of liberal political theory. But the new theory sought to advance beyond this abstraction by locating the individual socially, distinguishing the interest of different social classes determined by qualitatively different forms of property which they owned. The basis of this qualitative distinction was the economic functions performed by the three factors of production: land, labor, and capital, and the correspondingly distinct laws which determined the contributions to production of the different factors and the revenues accruing to the owners of those different forms of property. Thus, the abstract juridical relations of civil society, of liberal political theory, were given a substantive content defined by economic interest. The classical political economy saw society as being composed of social classes, which are defined on the basis of different economic functions, and whose social and political interaction was oriented by their economic interest and structured by the development of their economic relationships. The main concerns of classical political economy, from Petty to John Stuart Mill, were to identify the social classes that comprise society, to define the economic relationships between these classes, and to discover the laws that govern the development of these relationships. In a very literal sense, classical political economy saw its task as being the construction of a science of society. However, the economy was not seen as a realm independent of society. For classical political economy, the economy was the heart and soul of civil society. The history of classical political economy is the history of the attempt to develop this model of the economic foundation of society in abstraction from those causes, quote, that depend on the mutable minds, opinions, appetites, and passions of particular men, end quote. Petty. Finding the, quote, inner physiology of bourgeois society, end quote, as Marx called it, in the economic relations between classes. Marx, Theories of Surplus Value 2, page 165. This depended on isolating the economic foundations of social relations from extraneous moral, political, or religious considerations. The most complete and satisfying development of political economy is to be found in the work of Adam Smith, which located the analysis of economic relationships within a comprehensive theory of society, while its most rigorous economic development is found in the work of David Ricardo. The materialist conception of society. Classical political economy sought to develop a model of the ideal, harmonious society within which every form of property would have its proper place. However, The purpose of describing the contributions of different forms of property to the well-being of society as a whole was not so much to develop theoretical models as to set politics on a rational foundation, the ideal society defining an appropriate form of constitution and appropriate forms of legislation, taxation, and economy and social policy. Whence the term, quote, political economy. While the ideal was to construct a harmonious society, the different theories of political economy attach different degrees of importance to different forms of property, and so inevitably favored one class against another. However disinterested a particular thinker might be, political economy could not avoid being an intensely political field of study. The theories of political economy were based on the principles of 18th century materialism, which had developed within the broader framework of the intellectual and ideological revolution of the Enlightenment, which laid the foundations of modern bourgeois thought. The Enlightenment expressed a direct challenge to the fundamental principles of political and moral authority, which underlay the absolutist order. The Enlightenment replaced God by reason, and nature as the regulative principle of the moral, social, and political order. The Enlightenment replaced divine revelation by scientific inquiry as the source of truth, and it replaced the priest and philosopher by the scientist as the arbiter of propriety. The arbiter of propriety. The revealed truths of religion stood condemned as the false judgments of passion and ignorance. However, while the Enlightenment challenged the principles of absolutism, the Enlightenment by no means challenged the authority of the state, but rather sought to re-establish that authority by setting that authority on more secure foundations, appropriate to the new form of society which was emerging. The legitimation of the absolutist state rested on a modified version of the medieval conception of society based on status and organized into estates, held together by relations of spiritual and temporal authority. The medieval conception of society was that of a patriarchal hierarchy based on the model of the household. Within the household, order was maintained by the exercise of patriarchal authority, and this patriarchal model was extended to the social relations between households, the sovereign being ultimately under the authority of God. Thus, every member of society was subject to spiritual and temporal authority, within a framework of mutual rights and obligations, defined in terms of personal status. In the new society that was emerging, most dramatically in the towns, social position and social relations were defined not by divinely sanctioned status, but increasingly by property and by accumulation, which was in turn seen as a form of property, as the ownership of skills and tools of a trade. Property was not initially a homogeneous concept, to be attached uniquely to an individual and captured in a quantitative measure. It was differentiated so that consideration of the rights and obligations of the individual came to revolve around consideration of the rights and obligations attached to different forms of property, in relation to one another and to the sovereign. Thus, consideration of property was not initially opposed to the consideration of society in terms of status, but status was progressively detached from the person and embodied instead in property. As relations based on personal status were progressively eroded with the growth of commercial relations, So the concept of society, as a network of relations between persons, gave way to a conception of society as a network of relations between different forms of property. Similarly, the state came to be seen increasingly as a juridical body, sustaining the established order by regulating the relationships between the various forms of property. This, quote, dehumanization of society undermined the self-evident sanctity of the established order and called for new ways of understanding the possibility of a stable and harmonious social order, on the one hand, and of justifying the political reforms required to achieve that order on the other. Thus, the medieval conception of society was modified firstly by providing a rational foundation for the authority of the sovereign over his subjects, and to the patriarch over his dependent household, and secondly, by recognizing the jural and moral rights and obligations entailed in the establishment of contracts as the typical form of social relation between property owners. Society thus came to be conceptualized as a political order whose foundation was some form of real or implied contract. The juridical relations of right and obligation that bound the members of society together, under the superintendence of the sovereign, were no longer defined and differentiated according to personal status and sanctioned by God, but came to be conceived in terms of the, quote, natural laws that accorded with reason, that govern the rights and obligations of individuals as property owners, and that guided sound government. This view of society as a juridical order, regulated by a sovereign subject to the obligations to respect the natural laws, embodied in the rights and obligations of the individual as property owner, dominated the political theories which emerged in the second half of the 1600s. While those theories challenged the absolutist principles of divine right and arbitrary authority, they retained the absolutist conception of the state as the integrating center of society. And so, while those theories challenged the absolutist principles of divine right and arbitrary authority, those theories retained the absolutist conception of the state as the integrating center of society, so that the differential rights and obligations of different forms of property were defined in terms of their contribution to the stability of the political order. Thus, for example, the constitutional privileges of landed property were defended by reference to the relations of deference and authority which landed property embodied, and which the state was called on to reinforce, while the commercial privileges of mercantile property were defended by reference to mercantile property's contribution to the coffers of the state. The various theories proposed sought to establish the authority of the state on a rational foundation. The principal problem was that of the relationship between law and authority, between the natural rights of the individual property owner and the delegated authority of the sovereign. This problem was defined by a particular philosophical conception of human nature, which determined the potential challenge to the social and political order presented by unregulated human inclinations, and so the extent to which the authority of the state was called on to impose the rule of reason on human passions. However, different thinkers had different conceptions of human nature, according to the form of constitution they sought to defend. The ultimately arbitrary foundation of these juridical theories became increasingly apparent in the course of political debate, so that it became imperative to find a more secure foundation on which to build social and political theory. This was the achievement of 18th century materialism. 1700s materialism sought to replace philosophy by science as the means of uncovering the natural laws of society. 1700s materialism was able to do this because it no longer sought to criticize the political order from the standpoint of an abstract human nature, but from the more mundane standpoint of the economic and moral progress of society, to which the corruption and parasitism of the state presented an increasingly serious barrier. That political order was best adapted to the moral, intellectual, and material progress of society, while the foundation of moral and intellectual progress was firmly identified with material progress. Thus, materialism diverted attention from the philosophical investigation of human nature to the scientific investigation of the laws that govern the economic progress of society. Different forms of property were henceforth to be evaluated not according to the natural rights of property, although the sanctity of property continued to be presumed, nor according to their contribution to the state, but according to their contribution to material progress. Thus, attention moved to what we now recognize as economic questions, and political philosophy gave way to political economy as the cornerstone of the theory of society. Society was no longer seen as an expression of human nature, but as an order regulated by society's own laws that were not the result of human design and that could not be modified by human intervention. These laws were generally considered to be divinely inspired, but they were no more amenable to divine than to human intervention. These laws could therefore be known scientifically, whether through experiment, Smith, or through the exercise of reason, physiocracy, and they had to be respected if harmony were to prevail. Thus, quote, nations stumble upon establishments which are indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design, end quote. Ferguson. Society is governed by, quote, natural laws. Quote, all men and all earthly powers sought to be subject to these sovereign laws instituted by the Supreme Being. These natural laws are immutable and indisputable, and the best laws possible. Thus they are the foundation of the most perfect government and the fundamental rule for all positive laws. End quote. Quesnay. Francois Quesnay, the physiocrat. However, although these laws are, quote, self-evident, these laws are not necessarily known or observed. It is essential that, quote, the nation should be given instruction in the general laws of the natural order, which constitute the form of government, which is self-evidently the most perfect, end quote. Hence, education of the public and enlightenment of the sovereign is the prime condition for good government. Again, Quesnay. 18th century materialism was naturalistic, but by no means fatalistic. For 18th century materialism introduced a fundamental distinction between the external world of physical nature, which was governed by immutable and irresistible laws, and the internal world of human nature, which is characterized by a division between the psychological faculties of reason and passion, intellect and emotion. While the primeval instincts of passion expressed the continued subordination of humanity to nature, reason enabled humanity to transcend the constraints of its internal nature. Nature became an external world, which provided no more than the raw material which humanity could appropriate, intellectually and practically, in order to subordinate nature to humanity's own intellectual and material needs. Quote, progress was measured precisely by the extent to which humanity had freed itself from nature, by subjecting nature to humanity's own intellectual and practical rule. This subordination of nature was achieved by the progressive realization of the rule of reason. For the materialist, the development of the forces of production was both the measure of the progress of practical reason and the means by which humanity freed itself from the constraint of natural scarcity. To subordinate ignorance and passion to intellectual and moral reason, this development was neither an intellectual nor a political enterprise, but could only be achieved in and through, quote, civil society, which is established as the mediating term between reason and nature. The divorce between reason and nature constituted human society as a self-sufficient realm, and so is the potential object of a new, quote, historical science. The historical development of civil society, embodied in the practical mastery of natural forces and production, became the measuring rod of progress, and in particular, of the appropriate forms of, quote, manners and morals of the Constitution, legislation, and public policy. At the same time, this intellectual revolution shifted the focus of reformist projects against the absolutist belief that civil society had to be molded in accordance with the will of God, the needs of the state, and the dictates of human nature. The Enlightenment insisted that the state and human nature had to be adapted to the needs of civil society, according to the rule of reason. Nature defined the external limits to the rule of reason. Reason could harness the laws of nature, but reason could not override the laws of nature. However, the foremost barrier to progress lay not outside humanity, but within, in the residual power of the passions and of ignorance, which impede and subvert rational judgment. Progress then lay in the imposition of the intellect on natural inclinations. Quote, differences in intellect, which we observe among men, depend on the different circumstances in which they find themselves placed, and the different education which they receive, end quote. While, quote, all our false judgments are the effect either of our passions or of our ignorance, end quote. Helvetius. Reform is both possible and necessary, and is to be guided by the exercise of reason that will dispel the prejudices of passion and ignorance that are the source of bad government. The basis of rational reform can only be the scientific understanding of the causes of the progress of society. The physiocratic theory of society. The materialist conception of society emerged in the mid-18th century as thinkers throughout Europe sought to discover an objective foundation for morals and for social and political institutions. It is difficult to entangle influence from independent conception, so rapid was the development, but it is generally agreed that the decisive moment was the publication of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws in 1748, which offered the most influential early formulation of a materialist conception of society. For Montesquieu, the natural factors determining the forms of law, manners, and customs in a society were the geographical factors of soil and the climate, but Montesquieu also considered the independent influence of the mode of subsistence, the form of government, and the so-called spirit of the nation. Helvetius soon noted the empirical inadequacy of the climatic explanation and invoked population pressure as the primary source of progress. But it was the physiocrats and Adam Smith who first systematically related political and social institutions and the so-called moral sentiment to the mode of subsistence, probably reaching their conclusions independently around 1750 or 1751. The physiocrats theorized the contribution of large-scale agriculture to the well-being of society, and in so doing, developed a model of society as a whole. This theory was opposed primarily to the mercantilist doctrines which had been dominant hitherto. Like the mercantilists, the physiocrats identified national wealth with the formation of a surplus, and evaluated particular forms of property by their contribution to that surplus. However, the importance of this surplus was not identified directly, and its contribution to the reserves of the state, as it had been by mercantilism, but more broadly with the provision of a fund which could be mobilized alternatively in unproductive expenditure, whether by the state or by individuals, or in fostering economic development by improving agriculture. This meant that the physiocrats did not conceive of the surplus only in terms of money, as had the mercantilists, but primarily in physical terms, as a surplus of produce, distinguishing the sterility of money lending from the productivity of agricultural investment. More fundamentally, the physiocratic theory immediately meant that the evaluation of forms of property was no longer confined within the limits of the existing political order, as it was for mercantilism, but was conceived more broadly in terms of their differential contributions to the well-being of society. This in turn led the physiocrats to construct a model of the flow of goods between different classes without the intermediation of the state, and so led them to develop the first rigorous theory of the economic foundations, not only of the state, but also of the emerging civil society. The physiocrats divided society into the, quote, productive class, the, quote, proprietors, and the sterile class, so-called sterile class. The productive class represented agricultural producers and was divided into wage laborers and entrepreneurs. The proprietors were the class of landowners, while the merchants and manufacturers made up the sterile class, within which wage laborers and entrepreneurs were not systematically distinguished. Manufacture is sterile because manufacture simply transforms existing products in the form of agricultural foodstuffs and raw materials into manufactured goods without producing any surplus. Agriculture, by contrast, produces a net product, which is attributed to the powers of nature and which accrues to the proprietor in the form of rent. The implication of this model is that rent is the sole form of the surplus. So the maximization of the surplus is identified with the maximization of rent, which is achieved by augmenting the productivity of agriculture. Although some use the model to defend landed property, it is not landed property but agricultural enterprise which is productive. Landed property simply appropriating the God-given benefits of nature by virtue of its engrossing the land. The most productive form of agricultural enterprise was identified by the physiocrats as large-scale and increasingly capitalist farming. Thus, the general conclusion drawn was that progress depends on fostering the growth of large-scale farming through the concentration of enterprises and through agricultural investment, which could best be achieved by a regime of laissez-faire that provides the basis for the expansion of markets. The identification of the interests of the large-scale farmer with those of society as a whole by no means imply that the physiocrats were simply the ideological representatives of a particular class. The physiocrats' primary concern was with the stabilization of the political regime, and the physiocrats' primary appeal was to the statesman, proposing that the power of the state should be strictly limited by the fact that it has to respect the natural laws of the economy if the state is not to impede progress. This implied that the state should not intervene with those laws, restricting itself to the protection of the realm of individual liberty and of property, and in the case of Kine, diverting some of the net product to agricultural investment. Constitutionally, this implied that the state should be disengaged from all forms of class representation, to take the form of an enlightened despotism, guided by the divinely ordained natural laws discovered by the physiocrats, whose foundation would be best secured by a system of education to propagate the principles of physiocracy. Little footnote. The physiocrats did not see profit as an independent form of revenue. Entrepreneurial profits were seen as a form of wage. Although exceptional profits might be earned by increasing productivity or reducing costs, while commercial profits were a diversion from rent based on monopoly power. Manufacturing investment was considered as a diversion, not from the surplus, but from consumption, as entrepreneurs saved from their normal revenue. End of footnote. The political program of physiocracy had a growing appeal in mid-1700s France. It certainly was the case that commerce was stagnating, while agriculture was the most dynamic sector of the economy. Agriculture's development impeded by taxation, proprietorial privileges, and commercial regulation. The rapid development of capitalist agriculture would favor not only the emerging class of agricultural entrepreneurs, but also offered a way of resolving the growing social and political problems confronting the state by expanding the available surplus and so promising to ameliorate the growing conflict over rent and taxation that set the peasantry against both landed proprietors and the state. However, the contradiction inherent in the physiocratic program was that the development of large-scale capitalist farming could only be at the expense of small-holding peasantry, so that the physiocratic solution could only exacerbate social tensions in the short term. The theoretical limitations of physiocracy lay in its continual adherence to natural law doctrines and to Cartesian rationalism on the one hand, and in physiocracy's insistence that agriculture alone was productive on the other. It was Adam Smith who overcame these limitations, rejecting the, quote, self-evidence of the truths of physiocracy, replacing Cartesian rationalism with the empiricism of his friend David Hume, and recognizing the productivity of manufacture by introducing the concept of capital, or, quote, stock, independent from land and labor. In modifying the fundamental assumptions of physiocracy in this way, the division of society was changed from that between agriculture, manufacture, and the proprietors to that familiar today between the landed class, the capitalist class, and the laboring class. Some footnotes. The later physiocrats did abandon this insistence to recognize the productivity of manufacture without systematically developing its theoretical implications. And 4. Another footnote. The extent to which Smith's work remains within the framework of natural law doctrines is a question of interpretation that is still hotly disputed. On the one hand, the differences between Smith's appeal to reason as a psychological propensity, as opposed to the physiocrat's view of reason as an a priori truth, is purely rhetorical, the evidence for both resting on intuition. On the other hand, Smith did not follow the physiocrats in regarding intuition as the conclusive proof of his theories, but sought instead to establish their truth through extensive comparative and historical investigation. Smith's theory of moral sentiments. Smith's theory of society is to be found in 3 works: the Theory of Moral Sentiments, the Lectures on Jurisprudence, and the Wealth of Nations. Although Smith is thought of today as an economist, the 3 books form a whole. The historical framework for Smith's analysis of his own society is provided by what Meek has called the, quote, 4 stages theory. According to the 4 stages theory, the mode of subsistence is the fundamental determinant of the forms of property and government, social institutions, and moral sentiments current in a society. There are 4 fundamental modes of subsistence underlying the 4 types of society: hunting, pasturage, agriculture, and commerce. These stages are arranged in an ideal evolutionary succession of material and corresponding moral, political, and intellectual progress. The basis of this progress is the extension of the division of labor, which gives rise to growing social differentiation between town and country, arts and manufacture, different occupations and professions, and different social classes. The extension of the division of labor increases the social surplus which, if properly applied, furthers the division of labor and leads to a diffusion and proliferation of property. This in turn provides the foundation for the growing independence of the state set up to defend property from any particular interest and for the progress of the moral sentiments. In The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith explored the material foundation and social development of moral sentiments. Smith's starting point was the materialist assertion that, quote, the understanding of the greater part of men are formed by their ordinary employment, end quote, Adam Smith. However, Adam Smith did not adopt the utilitarian thesis advanced later by Bentham, that people were guided by pure self-interest, nor even Hume's limited identification of utility with pleasure. For Smith, the moral sentiments were formed socially, and the basis of the moral judgment was the sense of, quote, propriety, of the beauty of a well-ordered whole. The basis of judgments of propriety was, quote, sympathy, the ability to adopt the position of the, quote, impartial and well-informed spectator, end quote, in relation both to our own and other people's conduct. And it was sympathy that conditioned our approval of, quote, benevolence, of conduct that was conducive to the well-being of society. For example, people did not desire wealth for wealth's own sake, for Smith had a puritanical skepticism about the pleasures to be derived from wealth, but for the sake of the social approbation that was attached to the possession of wealth. The source of the moral sentiment was passion and not reason, but the effect of the mechanism of sympathy was that socially beneficial passions were endorsed, with harmful passions, while harmful passions were condemned. Thus, the empirical principle of sociability replaced the natural law principle of obligation. Sympathy is not sufficient to restrain the negative impulses that express self-love. A degree of self-love is necessary for every individual to fulfill her social role, so that in seeking to achieve her own interest, social benefits ensue. However, unmoderated self-love could have harmful effects when not restrained by benevolence, as selfishness led the individual to seek her ends by antisocial means. Such selfishness could be the result either of inadequate moral restraint, as when the individual had only a restricted circle of social contacts, or of ignorance, where individuals are inadequately aware of their own best interests. Moral education in a wide circle of social contacts, such as were provided by an extended division of labor, would contribute to the perfection of the moral sentiments. Smith's theory of moral sentiments provided a neat account of the moral order of society, such as would be recognizable to any modern sociologist, but for Smith, this moral order was strictly subordinate to the economic order whose reproduction this moral order served. Thus, it was not the basis of his theory of society, but provided only a link in the explanation of how a society based on the pursuit of self-interest could be sustained. Moreover, the moral sentiments alone were not sufficient for the maintenance of good order in society. Above the moral sentiments stood the state, and beneath them lay the division of labor. In Smith's lectures on jurisprudence, he examined the nature and functions of the state, part of which discussion was resumed in The Wealth of Nations. The state was seen as a set of institutions which had a strictly limited and largely negative role in preserving a good social order. The state was the repository of law rather than of authority. And its primary function was to protect the rights of the individual as a man, as a member of a family, and as a member of society. Smith argued that, quote, justice is the main pillar that holds the whole edifice, end quote. Smith. This was not because justice could ordain the propriety of social relationships, for benevolence could not be enforced, but because only justice could preserve the rights of the individual to life, liberty, and property, and so guarantee the framework of civil society within which benevolence can moderate the abuses of misguided self-love. The framework was provided by the relationship of the individual to his, not usually her, because the woman was a dependent member of a patriarchal family, legally acquired property, and by the member relationships established by the division of labor that were mediated by the free and equal exchange of property. The wealth of nations. Both the theory of moral sentiments and the theory of the state depended on Smith's identification of the moderated and restrained pursuit of self-interest with the improvement of social well-being. It was this identification that was first systematically theorized in The Wealth of Nations, which was the foundation of Smith's entire social and political theory. For Smith, progress was identified with the extension of the division of labor, including the application of machinery. That was the foundation of the increasing productivity of labor. Quote, this division of labor is not originally the effect of any human wisdom. This division of labor is the necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, which has no such extensive utility, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. End quote. Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith. This propensity, Smith argued, was probably, quote, the necessary consequence of the faculties of reason and speech, end quote, rather than being a mere natural instinct, through the rational consideration that if I want the help of others, I do better to interest their self-love in my favor than to appeal to their benevolence alone. Thus, each, in rational pursuit of her own ends, achieved spontaneously the progressive extension of the division of labor. The extension of the division of labor was limited by the extent of the market. The expansion of production enlarged the market, providing the basis for an extension of the division of labor, and so for a further expansion of production. The extension of the division of labor, if confronted by no, quote, unnatural barriers, was thus a cumulative process. Any barriers to the freedom of exchange restricted the possibilities of self-improvement available to the individual, and so restricted the progress of society. Thus Smith established that free exchange was the condition for the most rapid development of the division of labor, and so of the wealth of nations. However, it is not sufficient to consider only the production and exchange of wealth. the problem of the proper regulation of society is raised most particularly by the question of the distribution of the product. Smith's great originality lay in his development of a theory of distribution that enabled him to conceptualize the different interests of the different classes of society, and so to identify the best means of reconciling their interests. It was Smith who first systematically introduced into social theory the fundamental distinction between the three component classes of capitalist society: the owner of so-called stock, the landowners, and the wage laborers. He achieved this by means of an analysis of the component parts of the price of a commodity. Smith's analysis of class rests on the observation that production depends on the technical cooperation of the three distinct factors of production: land, labor, and so-called stock. These factors of production are the property of individuals who sell the services of their appropriate factor in exchange for a revenue. Thus, the distinction between land, labor, and stock defines the distinction between the corresponding revenues, rent, wages, and profit, which accrue to the owners of the appropriate factors of production. It is these three revenues which constitute the component parts of the price of a commodity. The laws which govern these revenues accordingly define the distinctive interest of the three classes corresponding to the factor of production, which constitutes the source of each class's revenue. Moreover, since these three revenues exhaust the product, there can be no other source of revenue, all other revenues deriving ultimately from one of these sources. So that the interest of every member of society is ultimately attached to one of the three classes. Smith's account of the component parts of the price of a commodity was notoriously ambiguous. On the one hand, he argued that profit and rent in some sense represented deductions from the product of labor. The laborer now had to share her product with the capitalist and landowner. If this were the case, then the value of the commodity would be the amount of labor bestowed on it, and it would not be self-evident that the interests of the laborer coincided with those of the capitalist and landowner, since profits and rent could increase, given the productivity of labor, only at the expense of wages. On the other hand, Smith argued that profit and rent did not represent deductions from the product of labor, but corresponded in some way to the original contributions made to the product by capital and land. Thus, profit, rent, and wages were independent component parts of the value of a commodity, and there was no reason to conclude that increasing rents and profits were at the expense of wages. This latter is the argument that Smith typically adopted in The Wealth of Nations. Thus, for example, Smith tended to argue that an increase in money wages would not lead to a fall in profits, but to an increase in prices. He then introduced the distinction between the producer and the consumer, so that price increases were passed on to the consumer, failing to recognize that the consumer could ultimately only be the wage laborer, capitalist, or landowner wearing another hat. The introduction of this device of the consumer frequently prevented Smith from following through the logic of his arguments in a systematic investigation of the social relations between the component classes of society. The purpose of the examination of the component parts of price was not to lead into an examination of prices, but to establish the basis on which the national product is divided between the component classes of society. Quote, wages, profit, and rent are the three original sources of all revenue, as well as of all exchangeable value. All other revenue is ultimately derived from some one or other of these. End quote. In particular, interest is a deduction from profit, and taxation is a drain on revenue. Smith turned to the examination of the determination of the different forms of revenue, and so to the material foundation of the interests of the different social classes that comprise society. It is in considering the different forms of revenue independently of one another that Smith definitively abandoned the embodied labor theory of value in favor of the independent component parts of value. Smith retained a labor theory of value only in the sense that he uses labor commanded as the most convenient measure of value, because Smith believed that this provided the most stable standard of value, although it should be added that Smith was not altogether consistent in this. Thus, the labor value of a commodity was not the number of hours of labor entailed in its production, but the number of hours of labor that could be commanded by its price. The latter would be greater than the former to the extent of profit and rent. Thus, the theory of rent analyzed the independent component parts of the real price of a commodity. Only introducing the labor standard in order to facilitate long period comparisons that abstracted from the changing value of money. Smith's labor theory of value served not as the basis of his analysis of social relations between the classes, but only as a convenient accounting device. The rapid abandonment of the embodied labor theory of value had independent implications, for it meant that the revenues of the different classes could be considered independently of one another. This meant in turn that Smith was not compelled to consider systematically the relation between these revenues, nor the social relations between the classes that comprise society. Smith considered the three original sources of revenue not in relation to one another, but in relation to their independent contributions to and benefits from economic growth. The interdependence of these classes was located only in the technological interdependence of the factors of production, to which the revenues correspond, as an aspect of their cooperation in the division of labor. Land, labor, and stock are the universal foundations of social differentiation, and are considered on par with other functional distinctions, such as that between agriculture and manufacture, as aspects of the technical division of labor characteristic of any developed society. This is why Smith could not conceive of any but the simplest society, except in terms of the categories appropriate to his own. And this is why he proceeded immediately from that, quote, early rude state of society, end quote, to a society in which stock has accumulated in the hands of particular persons who, quote, will naturally employ it to set to work industrious people, end quote. Wealth of nations. Wages are determined by the balance between the supply of and the demand for labor. However, quote, there is a certain rate below which it seems impossible to reduce, for any considerable time, the ordinary wages, even of the lowest species of labor. End quote. Wealth of Nations. In the wage bargain, the masters have the upper hand. So the tendency is for the wage to fall to this minimum. However, an increasing demand for labor, associated with an increasing revenue in the form of profit and rent, which constitutes the fund out of which wages are paid, enables the laborers to, quote, break through the natural combination of masters not to raise wages, end quote. Quote, the demand for those who live by wages, therefore, necessarily increases with the increase of the revenue and stock of every country, and cannot possibly increase without it, end quote. Hence, the laborers have an interest in the progressive increase in rent and profits, since this alone can secure increased wages for them. Moreover, quote, the liberal reward for labor, end quote, is socially beneficial. Quote, no society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable, end quote. More to the point, the liberal reward for labor encourages the growth of population and encourages the, quote, industry of the common people, end quote. The effect of accumulation on wages is beneficial to the workers, to the masters, and to the nation. Profits are necessary to encourage the owner of stock to hazard his stock by employing laborers. The size of profits, however, is determined by the relation between the size of stock and the opportunities for that stock's employment. Although the opening of new investment opportunities may lead to an increase in profits, Smith assumed that the general tendency is for the increase of stock to lower profits as competition between the owners of stock for investment opportunities increases. Thus, accumulation tends to increase wages but to lower profits. However, it is not wages. Thus, accumulation tends to increase wages but to lower profits. However, it is not the increase in wages that causes lower profits, although low wages can be a source of high profits and vice versa. But rather, it is the independent relationship between the supply of investment funds and the opportunities that confront them that determines the decline in profits. Thus, in a society in which opportunities are so exhausted that accumulation reaches its limits, both wages and profits will be low. Accumulation, although it increases the mass of profits, tends to lower the rate of profit. This means that the owners of stock have an ambiguous interest in economic progress and are tempted to seek to increase the rate of profit artificially. Such measures are, however, extremely harmful to society. Quote, in reality, high profits tend much more to raise the price of work than high wages, end quote. because high wages encourage industriousness and growth of population. Thus, higher profits restrict the growth of the market, and so the extension of the division of labor. Quote, our merchants and master manufacturers complain much of the bad effects of high wages in raising the price, and thereby lessening the sale of their goods both at home and abroad. The merchants and master manufacturers say nothing concerning the bad effects of high profits. They are silent with respect to the pernicious effects of their own gains. End quote. Wealth of Nations. Smith's analysis of rent is even more ambiguous than his analysis of profit. On the one hand, rent is seen not as an independent component of the price, but as whatever is left over after normal wages, and ordinary profits have been deducted. An increase in rent can therefore only be at the expense of wages or profits. Rent is not a form of profit, due as a result of investment of stock in the land, but is the, quote, monopoly price, determined by, quote, what the farmer can afford to give, end quote. Thus, quote, rent enters into the composition of the price of commodities in a different way from wages and profits. High or low wages and profit are the cause of high or low price. High or low rent is the effect of it. End quote. Wealth of Nations. However, if rent is a deduction from price, the question arises, what determines the price? The price cannot be determined by the sum of profits, wages, and rent, if rent depends in turn on price. Smith's answer was to follow the physiocrats in relating rent to the natural fertility of the soil. Thus, the total product is fixed, and rent is what remains after the deduction of wages and profits. It arises because the natural powers of the soil make agriculture more productive than manufacture. Clearly, however, rent depends not on the size of the product, but on the value of the product. Clearly, however, rent depends not on the size of the product, but on the value, the price of the product. Thus, Smith went into an extended investigation of the relationship between the prices of agricultural produce, of other raw materials, and of manufactured goods. The basic conclusion is that the relative prices of non-food raw materials rise and those of manufacturers fall in relation to the prices of foodstuffs, so that, quote, every improvement in the circumstance of society tends either directly or indirectly to raise the real rent of land, to increase the real wealth of the landlord, end quote. This argument may explain why rent should increase, but this argument does not provide any explanation either for the existence or the level of rent. However, the conclusion that Smith had reached is the one that was essential to him, for the conclusion enabled him to identify the interest of the landowner with the general improvement of society. For the landowner's gain from, quote, every improvement in the circumstances of society, end quote. And this was of fundamental importance in the constitutional circumstances of Smith's time. Smith concluded his investigation of rent by examining the interests of the three different orders of people. The quote, three different orders of people. Quote, those who live by rent, quote, those who live by wages, and quote, those who live by profits. The interests of the first order, the landowners, quote, is strictly and inseparably connected with the general interests of society, end quote, as is that of the laborer. Those who live by profit are those, quote, whose stock puts into motion the greater part of the useful labor of every society, end quote. But the rate of profit tends to fall with progress, and the great merchants and manufacturers, although they have, quote, more acuteness of understanding than the landowners, are concerned with their own particular interests rather than those of society. Quote, the interest of the dealers is always in some respect different from, and even opposite to, that of the public, end quote. They have exercised their own abilities to impose on the gullibility of the other orders of society, having, quote, an interest to deceive and even to oppress the public, end quote, by narrowing competition. The constitutional conclusion that Smith reached, the constitutional conclusions that Smith reached, are developed later in The Wealth of Nations and elsewhere, but they can be summarized as the need for a balanced constitution in which the oppressive dangers of monarchy are balanced by, quote, democracy, the parliamentary representation of property, and the need for public education to which Smith attached great importance. Public education is desirable because the state of society does not, quote, naturally form in the people, quote, the abilities and virtues which that state requires, end quote. So, quote, some attention of government is necessary in order to prevent the almost entire corruption and degeneracy of the great body of the people, end quote. So making the great body of the people, quote, less liable to the delusions of enthusiasm and superstition, which among ignorant nations frequently occasion the most dreadful disorders, less apt to be misled into any wanton and unnecessary opposition to the measures of government. End quote. Wealth of Nations. However, Smith was not too confident of the powers of reason in the face of the persuasive power of the merchants and manufacturers. Smith's conclusion was that, quote, all systems of either preference or restraint, being thus completely taken away, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest in his own way, and to bring both his industry and his capital into competition with any other man or order of men. According to the system of natural liberty, the sovereign has only three duties to attend to. First, the duty of protecting society from the violence and invasion of other independent societies. Secondly, the duty of protecting as far as possible, every member of society from the injustice or oppression of every member of it, or the duty of establishing an exact administration of justice, and thirdly, the duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works and certain public institutions, end quote, the wealth of nations. The good order and progress of society depends on the existence of a state that will maintain justice, and so the rule of competition, and so the Jesus Christ, the good order and progression of society depends on the existence of a state that will maintain justice, and so the rule of competition, and on the development of the moral sentiments that will be advanced by the growth of industriousness and the extension of the division of labor, and that will be endorsed by the development of education. Smith's contribution to social theory. Smith is best remembered today as an economist and as the theorist of economic liberalism. However, as economics, his work is eclectic and unsystematic. His theory of wages derives from the physiocrats. His theory of rent still rests on physiocratic prejudice. And his theory of profit at best rests on an implicit, extended physiocratic identification of profit with the productive powers of stock. His account of the interests of the fundamental classes of society is equally unsystematic. He recognizes the morally harmful effects of large-scale industry and of the division of labor on the working class. So his identification of the interests of the workers with those of society rests wholly on the postulate that accumulation and accumulation alone can increase wages. His identification of the interest of the landowners in the improvement of society is equally tenuous, depending on an intuitive, if not wholly implausible, analysis of the relations between prices of foodstuffs, minerals, and manufactured goods. His identification of the relation of the owners of stock to accumulation rests on the neglect of any systematic investigation of the fundamental relationship between profits, rent, and wages, and between the rate of profit and the rate of accumulation. In short, his defense of economic liberalism rests more on faith than on any systematic analysis. However, the fundamental importance of Smith's work is not its technical contribution to economics, but the fact that it opens up an entirely new approach to society which earlier writers had partially anticipated, but which Smith first presented as a systematic and relatively coherent whole. Smith's contribution can be summed up under three headings. Methodologically, he was the first systematic social theorist to break definitively with the natural law tradition. In this, he replaced the rationalistic foundation of physiocracy with the empiricism of his friend David Hume, so separating social theory from philosophy in subjecting theoretical laws to empirical evaluation. Theoretically, Smith was the first to develop a systematic materialist conception of history based on the determining role of the mode of subsistence. Finally, the originality of his contribution is consummated in his theory of social class, for he was the first to analyze systematically the emerging capitalist society in terms of the fundamental class division between capitalists, landowners, and wage laborers. To many it may seem strange that Adam Smith, who is best known as the theorist of liberal individualism, should be acclaimed for his contribution to the class theory of society. However, there is no paradox here. For in Smith's work, there is no conflict between individual aspiration and class affiliation. Smith's conception of social class is quite different from the medieval conception of an estate, a corporate body of which membership entails differential rights and obligations. Social classes are not corporate entities in this or in any other sense. Social classes arise because of the functional differentiation established in the course of development of the division of labor between stock, land, and Social classes arise because of the functional differentiation established in the course of development of the division of labor between labor, land, and stock as factors of production. All means of subsistence derive from the collaborative employment of land, labor, and stock, and all revenues derive ultimately from one or other of these factors of production. In the, quote, early and rude state of society, the same person owned all three factors of production and so appropriated all three revenues. With the development of the division of labor, their ownership becomes differentiated, so that the distinct revenues accrue to different people, thereby defining their different class interests. The interests of different members of society depend on the ultimate source of their revenues. Because the different forms of revenue are determined differently, the three factors of production which constitute the ultimate sources of all revenues define three differential class interests. However much they may conflict with each other in competition, capitalists, for example, have a common interest as owners of stock in relation to the owners of land and labor. Moreover, because there are ultimately only three sources of revenue in society, there are only three social classes, all, quote, intermediate strata, such as lawyers, priests, or government employees, must ultimately belong to one or other of these classes, depending on the ultimate source of their revenues. It is possible to straddle the classes, as does the independent artisan who is both laborer and owner of stock. But it is not possible to belong to society except through assimilation into its class system. For it is only as a member of a social class that it is possible to acquire access to a revenue with which to secure the means of subsistence. Although class interests are defined objectively, the members of those classes may not be aware of their interests and may not act in accordance with their interests. The capitalists have an acute awareness of their own interests, since the capitalists' very survival depends on them paying the closest attention to their interests. However, as we have seen, the capitalist interest is at variance with that of society, and so they seek constantly to deceive the public. The landowners, by contrast, are, quote, too often defective in their knowledge of their own and thus the public interest. Quote, That indolence, which is the natural effect of the ease and security of their situation, the landowner's situation, renders them too often not only ignorant, but incapable of that application of mind which is necessary in order to foresee and understand the consequences of any public regulation. The interest of the second order, that of those who live by wages, is as strongly connected with the interest of society as that of the first. But though the interest of the laborer is strictly connected with that of society, he is incapable either of comprehending what that interest, or of understanding that interest's connection to his own. End quote. Wealth of Nations. The laborer is only heard on particular occasions, quote, when his clamor is animated, set on, and supported by his employers, not for his, but for their own particular purposes. End quote. It is this ignorance which political economy must dispel. It is through his theory of class that Smith opened up the possibility of a systematic social science. Earlier students of society, most notably Gregory King, had entertained the idea of social classes, but had not established a rigorous foundation for their class distinctions. King, for example, identified 26 ranks of the population, differentiated on the basis of status, which could be classified in turn as belonging to the, quote, poorest sort, the, quote, middle sort, and the, quote, better sort. But the classification had no principled foundation. Political theorists, on the other hand, had approached society more systematically, but had tended to rely on a much more abstract conception of society, attempting to reduce the heterogeneity of statuses and of forms of property in order to establish the common foundation of the polity in the abstract individual. Smith made it possible to bridge the gap between the empirical and the theoretical approaches to society by making it possible to locate the political theorist's individual within a systematically organized society. Smith could do this because the systematic distinctions in society no longer depended on inherent differences in personal status, but rather on the material basis on which the individual participated in society. Although he still recognized the existence of gradations of rank and status. Thus, social differentiation was reconciled with the uniformity of human nature that had become the foundation of liberal political theory and continued to underlie the materialism of classical political economy. Moreover, the new theory was able to justify and reconcile both social differentiation and the freedom and security of the individual. Social and political differentiation was justified on the basis of the differential contributions of land, labor, and stock to the product and to the growth of the economy, while the freedom and security of the individual was justified by the need to give the individual the means and incentive to pursue her own ends in order to contribute to the betterment of society. Thus, the theory of class, far from compromising the individualism of liberal theory, makes it possible to rest liberal theory on a much more concrete foundation. Because it is possible to explore much more systematically the participation of the individual in society, it is possible to provide a defense of liberalism no longer solely on the basis of claims about human nature, but more practically in terms of the material benefits to which a liberal regime will give rise. In locating the individual socially and historically, Smith opened the way to an empirical social science, and his lead was soon followed in Scotland by Adam Ferguson and John Millar. However, Smith's approach continued to harbor fundamental weaknesses that also marked the work of the other members of the Scottish historical school. Despite its apparent concreteness, Smith's theory still rests on the speculative definition of a, quote, natural order of society, against which real societies and real history are measured. Smith was not really concerned with how particular societies actually work, but was much more concerned with how the ideal society would work, in order that he could measure his own and other societies against that ideal. This focus explains Smith's failure, on the one hand, to offer any adequate account of the relationship between the fundamental classes of society, and on the other, his failure to reconcile his materialism with any adequate conception of society. The failure to provide an adequate account of the relationship between the fundamental classes of society rests on the absence of any coherent theory of value, not in the narrow technical sense of a standard of price, but in a more fundamental sense of a theory that can account for the revenues of the different classes of society. Smith related wages, profits, and rent to labor, stock, and land, but he had no adequate theory of the relations between each of the terms. This weakness is not only of economic importance, for wages, profit, and rent are not simply economic categories. More fundamentally, they determine the interest of and relations between the fundamental classes of society, and arising out of these interests and social relations, they determine the form of government and the moral sentiments appropriate to the society. They determine not only the pattern of economic development, but also the moral, political, and intellectual development of society. The absence of a coherent theory of value means that Smith's entire social theory is ultimately based on anecdote and assertion. The weakness of Smith's theory of value could be remedied within the framework of his social theory, and indeed the history of economics is, as we shall see, primarily the history of the attempt to remedy this weakness. However, the lack of an adequate conception of history was a more serious deficiency, one which was not unique to Smith, but which derived from the theoretical perspectives of the Enlightenment on which he drew, and which defined the character and limits of liberal social thought. The limits of enlightenment. As we have seen, the fundamental concepts of the Enlightenment were those of reason and nature. However, nature appeared in a dual guise. On the one hand, there was the world of, quote, external nature, whose laws could be known but could not be modified by human intervention. On the other hand, there was the world of internal nature, of human impulses, passions, and emotions, which could be modified by their subordination to the human intellect, so that human morals, conduct, and institutions could be rationally adapted to human aspirations, subject to the constraints imposed by the immutable world of external nature. The dividing line between internal and external nature marks the limits of reason. Those human institutions are rational, which are based on the mastery of, quote, internal nature, within the limits of the constraints of, quote, external nature. These limits mean that the world which results is not the best of all conceivable worlds, but is the best of all possible worlds. The Enlightenment made reason its watchword. However, reason was not an invention of the Enlightenment. Previous philosophies had been equally committed to rational argument. What distinguished the Enlightenment was the conception of the world to which reason should be applied. It is not so much the Enlightenment's commitment to rational criticism which distinguishes the thought of the Enlightenment, but rather its dualistic conception of nature, which defines the possibilities and limits of rational criticism in radically distinguishing between internal and external. Nature, subject from is not so much its commitment to rational criticism which distinguishes the thought of the Enlightenment, but its dualistic conception of nature, which defines the possibilities and limits of rational criticism in radically distinguishing, quote, internal from, quote, external nature, subject from object, mind from matter. The dividing line between subject and object, between internal and external nature, between the mutable and the immutable, between the, quote, conceivable and the, quote, possible, is the basis of Enlightenment thought, and presented that thought with its central philosophical problem, that of providing a rational foundation for its conception of the world. For empiricism, this conception of the world was impressed on reason by the unmediated experience of the externality of nature. However, rationalism insisted that concepts cannot derive from immediate experience, but can only be imposed on experience by reason. In either case, quote, enlightenment consists in laying bare the truths imposed on immediate experience, whether by nature or reason or both, by analytically stripping that experience of the supervening layers of myth and superstition. Both rationalism and empiricism remain transcendental philosophies, unable to provide a rational foundation for the Enlightenment's view of the world, because each had to postulate an unknowable nature or reason as the condition of experience of that world. Hegel sought to overcome this dilemma by locating reason historically, so that the Enlightenment view of the world is not imposed on human experience by an external nature or an external reason, but is one which has been constructed by the historical development of reason through its progressive mastery of, quote, internal nature, as it displaces the superstition which attributes a, quote, supernatural origin to human institutions. History can still only be understood retrospectively, from the vantage point of a reason which stands outside the historical process. But Hegel's historicist perspective can at least account for the fact that reason only emerges to human consciousness at the end of capital H history. The implication of all these philosophies, made explicit by Hegel, is that the concrete human understanding of history is always provisional, confined within the limits of the historical achievements of reason. Limits expressed in the historically developed conceptions of the distinction between external and internal nature, between matter and spirit, between object and subject. The critical power of rational thought depends on its being aware of its provisional character as a historical product. Excuse me. However, Enlightenment thought abandoned its critical project at just this point, representing its own reason not as a historical product, the intellectual expression of a particular stage of human development, but as reason itself, the creative power and culmination of capital H history. In so doing, Enlightenment thought presented bourgeois thought and the bourgeois society depicted as rational by that thought as the culmination of the self-realization of reason. Thus, Enlightenment thought does not escape from the superstition which it sought to surpass. For like the Enlightenment's predecessors, it attributes a, quote, supernatural origin to human institutions, which are not explained as the concrete result of human practical activity, but as the product of a transcendent reason. In its idealist versions, the metaphysical character of this philosophy of history is plain to see. However, Smith's materialist conception of history is no less metaphysical in its, quote, naturalizing the progress of reason by attributing it to the advance of the division of labor. Reason for Smith is not a transcendental principle, but a human faculty. However, ignorance and immoderate self-love are barriers to the realization of this faculty. Barriers which are overcome as the development of the division of labor leads to the formation of the socially beneficial, quote, moral sentiments of moderated self-love and a growing awareness of the benefits of specialization. It is the self-evident rationality of the division of labor and of the associated social institutions of capitalist society, which underlies the historical process. It is the natural foundations of these institutions which placed them on the side of immutable, quote, external nature, to which reason must conform. It is this, quote, naturalization of bourgeois social institutions which constitutes Smith's theory for all its strengths as bourgeois. The rationality of the social institutions of capitalist society is determined by their rational conformity to the natural laws of production, distribution, and exchange. Smith's account of history is the story of the self-realization of this rationality. This means that for Smith, human institutions can have only one of two origins. Either they correspond to the order of reason, or they are the results of the misguided and misdirected human intervention. I didn't see anything. I messed something up there. This means that for Smith, human institutions can have only one of two origins. Either they correspond to the order of reason, or they are the results of misguided and misdirected human intervention. History is the study of barriers to progress, thrown up by the abuse of power motivated by pride, greed, vanity, prejudice, and ignorance. This history has a certain rationale, in that the unsavory characters who litter its pages were formed primarily by the circumstances of their material existence. But the more fundamental rationality of history lies outside history in the unnatural advance of the division of labor, accumulation of stock, and improvement in the productive powers of labor. Capitalism marks the end of this history, not because it abolishes want or brings production under human control, but because it marks the limits of human perfectibility, as the advance of reason comes up against the constraints imposed by the immutability of nature. Quote, economists have a singular method of procedure. There are only two kinds of institutions for economists, artificial and natural. The institutions of feudalism are artificial institutions. The institutions of the bourgeoisie are natural institutions. The relations of bourgeois production, therefore, are themselves natural laws, independent of the influence of time. They are eternal laws which must always govern society. Thus there has been history, but there is no longer any. End quote. Marx. Smith's conception of history as the self-realization of reason rests on his naturalistic conception of capitalist social relations of production. The foundation of this naturalistic conception of bourgeois society lies in his account of the formation of revenues, which is the basis of his theory of class. Smith did not account for the formation of revenues as a social process, appropriate to a particular form of society. Instead, he referred these revenues back to a natural origin. Thus, wages were referred back to the physiological subsistence requirements of the worker. Rent was determined by the natural productivity of land and profit. Land was determined by the natural productivity. Rent was determined by the natural productivity of land, and profit was, at least implicitly, related to the productive powers inherent in the forces of nature, including the division of labor set in motion by stock. Thus, the formation of wages, rent, and profit could be considered independently of the form of society, since their, quote, natural rates correspond to the natural properties of the universal categories of labor, land, and stock. The system of natural liberty, which is supposed to be the most conducive to social progress, is that in which, within the framework of justice that protects the, quote, sacred and inviolable, end quote, rights of property, the natural order of society can assert itself for the benefit of humankind. Since this order of society is so obviously natural, rational, and ideal, any interference with this order can only be seen as unnatural, irrational, and pernicious. Smith could not recognize that different modes of subsistence can give rise to different social relations. Indeed, Smith could not recognize that the relationships between the classes are social relations at all. For class membership is defined exclusively brought by the property relation between the individual and the factor of production which constitutes her revenue source. Smith had, therefore, no conception of history as the history of social relations in a continuous process of change. History begins with the, quote, accumulation of stock and the appropriation of the land, end quote. And history ends with the, quote, system of natural liberty, end quote. Between the two is merely the progressive advance of the division of labor, checked from time to time by the vices and ignorance to which man, in his imperfection, is heir. Ricardo's completion of the system. The technical weaknesses of Smith's theory were no barrier to its political and ideological success. The Wealth of Nations was, after all, a political tract as much as a work of science, and it was one that so accorded with the spirit of the times that it was greeted largely uncritically by those favorable to Smith's point of view. Smith's work was not universally accepted, nor did it immediately supplant all other works of political economy. For example, David Hume offered a much more sophisticated theory of money and a correspondingly more powerful critique of mercantilism. However, Smith's work immediately came to dominate political economic thought and continued to do so for decades to come. Moreover, Smith's work had an impact that went far beyond the policy-oriented debates of political economy, providing a framework that was taken up by social theorists and philosophers throughout Europe as a point of reference, if not a direct inspiration, to the extent that the specifically Smithian origins of the framework were soon lost to view. The technical weakness of Smith's system only began to become apparent when his sanguine assumptions about the natural harmony of class interests came to be challenged politically, so reopening consideration of the basis of class relations. The question of the relation between the fundamental classes of society was reopened in Britain by consideration of the economic and social dislocation precipitated by the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars had been a sharp increase in the price of grain, and so of agricultural rents, at the expense of wages and profits, and were followed by a serious recession. Although the war was not the only source of strain in a period of rapid capitalist expansion, the increased price of grain created real hardship for large sections of the population, and even if it was not the cause, could easily be made the scapegoat for successive waves of working class radicalism. Moreover, the price of grain, inflated by the corn and poor laws and by the debasement of the coinage, on top of a heavy tax burden, could easily be blamed for the recession through its impact on profits. Thus, widespread grievances surrounded the price of corn, monetary policy, the corn laws, the poor laws, and the burden of taxation directed attention to the impact of economic policy on the level of wages and profits, and so in the distribution of the product among the component classes of society. Consideration of these questions of economic policy was not simply an economic concern. In France, failure to deal adequately with similar grievances had precipitated a revolution, and radical agitation in Britain was sufficient to make the threat real at home. Thus, the point at issue was that of the proper organization of society, and particularly of the relation between the classes. And this had fundamental constitutional and political as well as economic significance. Thus, questions were raised that Smith's system could not answer. It fell to David Ricardo to bring the classical system to completion. Ricardo's starting point in his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation was to observe the inadequacy of the work of his predecessors, quote, respecting the natural course of rent, profit, and wages, end quote, identifying the determination of the, quote, laws which regulate this distribution, end quote, as the, quote, principal problem in political economy, end quote. Although Ricardo also modified the Smithian theory of money and of foreign trade, Ricardo's major contribution to political economy was a theory of society. Misread that. Although Ricardo also modified the Smithian theory of money and of foreign trade, Ricardo's major contribution to political economy as a theory of society was in addressing this problem and in his realization that the key to the solution of the problem lay in the theory of value. Ricardo took as his starting point the embodied labor theory of value, according to which the value of a commodity corresponds to the amount of time taken to produce it. The great advantage of such a theory for Ricardo's purpose was that the value of a commodity was given independently of the determination of wages, profit, and rent. Wages, profit, and rent could then be considered as proportionate shares of a fixed sum of value. Once any two of the revenues were determined, the third would be simply the remainder. For Ricardo, it was profit that was residual in this way. So to determine profit, he required only adequate theories of wages and of rent. Ricardo adopted the theory of differential rent, already developed by Anderson, West, and Malthus. According to this theory, rent was determined by the differential fertility of different pieces of land, and not, as Smith had thought, by the absolute fertility of the soil. Thus, the worst piece of land in use would pay no rent, while rent would arise on more fertile pieces of land in token of the extra profits that could be earned by the farmer because of the greater productivity of the soil. The greater the difference between the productivity of the best and worst land under cultivation, the greater would be the rent. Rent would be determined by the fact that succeeding pieces of land are progressively less fertile. Wages were determined for Ricardo, as for Smith, by the supply of and demand for labor, gravitating around the, quote, natural price of labor, end quote, which corresponded to the cost of the necessary means of subsistence, a sum which depended, following Malthus, on the, quote, habits and customs of the people, end quote. Ricardo went further than Smith, however, in offering an explanation for the fact that wages correspond to this subsistence minimum, and the basic explanation was again owed to Malthus. According to the Malthusian doctrine, if wages rose above the subsistence minimum as a result of legislative or charitable intervention, or as a result of an increased demand for labor, there would be an increase in population as more affluent workers would marry earlier and have more children, and more of these children would survive. This population increase would increase the supply of labor until the wage was forced back to the subsistence minimum. The only way in which the wage could remain above the minimum would be by the demand for labor running permanently ahead of its supply as a result of the rapid accumulation of capital. This theory clearly only applies in the long run, since the labor supply will take some time to adapt to the change in wages. In the short run, a different mechanism, that of the wages fund, is operative. According to this doctrine, the demand for labor was determined by the fund available to capitalists for the payment of wages. An increase in wages would reduce the demand for labor until the natural rate of wages had been restored. The implication of the two doctrines taken together is, of course, to reinforce Adam Smith's conclusion that the demand for labor, and so wages, can only increase as a result of increased capital accumulation. Wages cannot be increased by the poor law, by charity, by trade unions, or by cooperation. The reactionary implications of the theory, at a time of considerable distress among the working class, were clear. and were especially attractive to politicians whose instinctive response to the problems so caused was repressive rather than reformist. Having determined the level of wages and armed with the theory of differential rent, Ricardo was in a position to determine the rate of profit. Rent can be excluded from consideration by considering the situation of the capitalist on the marginal piece of land that bears no rent. The value of the commodity will be determined by the amount of labor embodied in the product of the marginal piece of land. On superior pieces of land, less labor will be required to produce an equivalent quantity of product because the land is more productive. Thus, the value of commodities is determined by the, quote, quantity of labor that will suffice for their production under the most unfavorable circumstances, end quote. And rent is determined by the difference between this value-determining quantity of labor and the lesser quantity actually bestowed on the product of the more fertile land. Having excluded rent by focusing on the marginal piece of land, Ricardo identified the share of the product that accrues to labor, that share being determined by the, quote, natural price of labor, while the residue accrues to the capitalist as profit. Thus, for Ricardo, although rent and wages are determined independently, the fact that the total available for distribution is given meant that he could theorize the dependence of profit on rent and wages, and so the relation between classes in a way that Smith could not. The function of the, quote, labor theory of value in Ricardo's theory is to give conceptual precision to the idea that national product available for distribution is a given magnitude, limited by the productivity and availability of labor that is divided up among the classes of society. In particular, it carries over to the determination of the component parts of the price of the individual commodity. The idea that the size of the national product is independent of its distribution. The independence of production from distribution that underlies Ricardo's theory of value does not carry over into a dynamic context. And Ricardo's main concern was not to study distributive shares for their own sake, but to consider the implications of changes in the pattern of distribution for the subsequent development of production, and the consequent implications of accumulation for the pattern of distribution. Within this dynamic context, he was concerned above all with the implications of changes in the price of corn and of the incidence of taxation on the pattern of accumulation. Ricardo's analysis of accumulation was centered on his account of the impact of accumulation on the rate of profit. As the economy developed and population grew, it became increasingly necessary to bring less fertile land into production so increasing rent, and through the rising cost of corn, wages. Thus, the proportion due to capital would decline in the course of accumulation. In the absence of countervailing factors that could only slow the decline, while the capital required for a given level of production would rise with rising costs of production. Thus, the rate of profit would decline continuously in the course of accumulation, and the prospect was one of rent absorbing more and more of the net product until eventually the rate of profit fell so low that further investment would cease. For Ricardo, the ultimate barrier to progress was seen not as the monopoly privileges of the large capitalists that boosted profits, but as the declining natural fertility of succeeding portions of land. This natural barrier could not be circumvented, but it was exacerbated by two factors that could be modified. One was the effect of the corn laws, which prevented the importation of corn and so kept corn prices high and less fertile land in production. The other was the poor law, which inflated the demand for corn and gave an unnatural stimulus to the growth of population, so undermining the positions of both capital and, by slowing accumulation, labor. Conservatism, radicalism, and socialism. Ricardo's theory of value gave classical political economy an analytic rigor and a cutting edge that Smith's formulation lacked. However, Ricardo did not supplant Smith as the theorist of liberal capitalism. Ricardo's Principles is essentially an extended commentary on the wealth of nations, lacking the breadth of the latter work and concentrating on its technical deficiencies. This has led to the view of Ricardo as the man who reduced political economy to the status of the, quote, dismal science. Thus, Marx in his earliest writings condemned the, quote, cynical Ricardo, for whom, quote, economic laws blindly rule the world. For Ricardo, men are nothing, the product, everything, end quote. Marx and Engels. This interpretation of Ricardo is misleading in being much too narrow. The importance of Ricardo's work for his contemporaries and for his classical successors was not primarily that it perfected the analysis of the economic machine, but that his work provided an account of the proper regulation of the class relations of his society that was more appropriate to the post-Napoleonic political conflicts than that of Adam Smith. The adherents of classical political economy were not especially impressed by Ricardo's concern for rigor. They were much more impressed by the results that he achieved. Ricardo modified Smith's analysis, most particularly in the status he accorded to the landowner. For Smith, the landowner's interest was identified with the general interest, while with Ricardo, quote, "The interest of the landlord is always opposed to the interest of every other class in the community." End quote. Ricardo. Such statements have led to another misleading interpretation of Ricardo that sees him as the radical theorist of the industrial bourgeoisie, arming itself for a decisive struggle with landed property. Such an interpretation considerably overemphasizes Ricardo's radicalism and the distance that separates him from other and more conservative political economists, from Smith to Malthus and McCulloch. Ricardo's attack on the landlords was confined to his attack on the Corn Laws and the Old Poor Laws. Ricardo did not attack landed property as such. Indeed, Ricardo was himself a landed proprietor. For Ricardo, rent was determined not by the existence of landed property, but by the differential fertility of the soil. While the barrier to accumulation was not landed property, but the niggardliness of nature. It was because rent was spent unproductively that it restrained accumulation. And in this, Ricardo simply followed Smith, drawing Smith's conclusion that landed property should bear the brunt of taxation. Ricardo's analysis stands out from that of all his contemporaries in its rigor, and in the starkness and clarity of his conclusions. However, although Ricardo's analysis eventually prevailed in Britain, it also met with fierce opposition. Rigor was no virtue if it led to unpalatable conclusions. Thus many prefer the vagueness and ambiguity of Smith, Say, or Sismondi to the harsh rigor of Ricardo. Nor did Ricardo's attack on the landed class go unchallenged. Malthus defended the landed interest against Ricardo. Asserting that the unproductive expenditure of the landed class is a virtue in averting the dangers of overproduction, while Sismondi extended the critique to the principles of laissez-faire. Nevertheless, while these various thinkers differed in the emphasis and detail of their analysis, which led to often very different political conclusions, they all developed their analysis on the common basis of the naturalistic theory of class, within the framework of the materialist philosophy of history, handed down by Smith. Thus, while they may have differed in their assessment of the proper relation between rent and profit, and of the role of the state in regulating that relation, they were in complete and unshakable agreement that capitalist class relations rest on a rational foundation, and they were in complete unanimity as to the proper role of the working class within society. All agreed that the working class should remain subordinate. The issue was to whom should it be subordinated? While Smith had drawn the constitutional conclusion from his analysis that the foundation of a sound constitution lay in the allied interest of the landed gentry and the emerging proletariat, the conclusion could be drawn from Ricardo's work that a sound constitution could only be based on the allied interests of agrarian and industrial capitalists and the proletariat. Thus, Ricardianism was turned into a radical weapon in the agitation leading up to the 1832 Reform Bill. Ricardo's theory could be developed in an even more radical direction that Ricardo himself would never even have contemplated. Although Ricardo established an inverse relation between wages and profits, he did not imagine for one moment that such a relation implied a conflict of interest between capital and labor. Wages were determined by the necessary means of subsistence and could only rise above the level of the necessary means of subsistence as a result of the rapid accumulation of capital on the basis of healthy profits. The Malthusian and wage fund doctrines ensured that any unnatural increase of wages, whether secured directly through trades union agitation, or indirectly through poor relief, would inevitably prove self-defeating by stimulating population growth and retarding accumulation. The inverse relation between wages and profit did not refer to an exploitative relation between worker and capitalist, but to the mechanism by which an increase in the price of corn, by raising money wages, eroded profits. However, the labor theory of value could easily be turned from a convenient analytical device into a moral statement about the rights of labor, so turning Ricardo's theory from an apologia into a critique of capitalism. If the worker was entitled to the full fruits of their labor, Ricardo's theory clearly showed that profit represented a deduction from the worker's entitlement. While Ricardian radicalism bound the worker to the capitalist in opposition to the landlord, Ricardian socialism incited the worker to turn on the capitalist too. Ricardo's theory was not only vulnerable to a socialist reinterpretation. Even in its own terms, it provided a very inadequate basis on which to defend capitalism. In abandoning the physiocratic foundations of Smith's theory, Ricardo also abandoned the justification of rent and profit. In Ricardo's system, rent and profit no longer corresponded to any real contribution to production. Rent was a deduction from the profit of the farmer that accrued to the landlord as an expression of the declining fertility of the soil that was the greatest barrier to human progress. The landlord benefited from increasing human misery. Profit was a deduction from the product of labor, a simple residue. Insofar as Ricardo defended profit, Ricardo referred to the reward for the capitalist who had foregone consumption for a period as the reward for waiting. But this defense is not very persuasive in the absence of any analysis that relates the supposed sacrifice of the capitalist to the size of his profit. Indeed, the greater his sacrifice, the faster the rate of profit falls. The idea that profit and rent are deductions from the product of labor could easily be transformed by the emerging socialists into a moral theory that saw profit and rent as unjust deductions made by parasitic landlords and capitalists. Smith's moral justification of capitalism was based fundamentally on the progressive character of the capitalist system. This, too, was seriously compromised in Ricardo's account. For Ricardo showed that both land and capital are ultimately barriers to progress. Land acts as a constant drain on profit, directing funds from investment into unproductive expenditure, and so slowing accumulation. Capital too acts as a barrier to progress. Since investment will only be made insofar as investment yields a profit, and as profits inevitably fall, investment will be curtailed. Ricardo's theory thus abandons any foundation on which capitalism could be justified morally. For Ricardo, there was no need to do so. Smith's struggles against the remnants of feudalism had been all but won. Even the defense of landed property by writers such as Malthus, now taking place within the framework of capitalism. The working class critique of capitalism in the name of a different, cooperative rather than competitive form of society had not yet become a powerful independent force. Thus, for Ricardo, the existence of capital, landed property, and wage labor was simply an inescapable fact of life, the natural foundation of any developed society. For Ricardo, as for Smith, the self-evident evils of other forms of society flowed, quote, from bad government, from the insecurity of property, and from a want of education in all ranks of the people, end quote. It was, quote, essential to the cause of good government that the rights of property should be held sacred, end quote. Ricardo. But the socialist movement that began to emerge just as Ricardo was writing was beginning to question not simply the constitutional arrangements of contemporary society, but the sanctity of property and the naturalness of competitive capitalism, generating instead a vision of society based on property held in common and on cooperation. Once the naturalness of capitalism and the sanctity of property were questioned, Ricardo's theory could be given a radical twist that sharply counterposed the interests of labor to those of both capital and landed property. Capitalism then came to be seen not as a natural, but as a historical form of society, a particular form of society that has not always existed and that is destined to be replaced. This was the direction in which Marx developed the initial insights of the, quote, Ricardian socialists. To develop a critique not only of political economy, but of the very foundations of liberal social theory. I will examine this critique in the next 2 chapters. Meanwhile, the rise of an independent working class, and particularly the development of Ricardian socialism at the end of the 1820s, had precipitated an ideological crisis in political economy. Although Ricardo's theory was technically far superior to Adam Smith's, the Ricardian labor theory of value, on which the potentially subversive deduction theory of profit rested, was technically deficient and could easily be abandoned by those who sought to evade the unacceptable conclusions that the socialists began to draw from the Ricardian system. The technical weakness of Ricardo's theory of value becomes apparent as soon as it is realized that relative prices do not in fact correspond to the amount of labor embodied in different commodities. If the sum profit earned by a capitalist were equal to the number of laborers employed, multiplied by the unpaid labor of each, the rate of profit would depend on the number of labor set to work by a particular capital, and the rate of profit on a capital that mobilized a large number of workers and little fixed capital would be higher than that of a capital that employed a large quantity of fixed capital, and so employed relatively few laborers. However, the mobility of capital, fostered by the credit system, means that the rate of profit on different capitals tends to be equalized as capitals flow from the less towards the more profitable outlets. Hence, profit is related to the size of capital and not to the number of laborers employed. Ricardo realized that the employment of fixed capital and the varying turnover times of different capitals modified his theory of value in this way. But it did not trouble Ricardo because Ricardo was interested not in relative prices but in problems of growth and distribution. Thus he sought to develop a, quote, invariable measure of value, end quote, that would enable him to consider problems of growth and distribution without having to worry about divergences due to differences in the proportion of fixed capital employed. However, the, quote, contradiction at the heart of Ricardian theory of value provided a strong lever for those who wished to reject the labor theory of value and the associated deduction theory of profit. Even Ricardo's closest followers, James Mill and McCulloch, modified Ricardo's theory to incorporate the independent contribution to value made by fixed capital, while the, quote, vulgar economists abandoned the labor theory altogether to return to Smith's theory of revenues as the independent component parts of price, an approach which was to be rigorously developed by the marginalist school of economics, which emerged in the last quarter of the 19th century.